So, I've mentioned in several of the different views that people have of the message and the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, and even their concepts of who the audience of those commands is intended to be. But let me give you a little bit more detail on a few of the most common beliefs I think are some of the most diabolical and morally devastating, faulty views of the purpose for the Sermon on the Mount and of its message and of the mandates that are found in the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to quote a lot from Pennington, who does a very good job of encapsulating several of these key views in a way that'll make it a little bit easier than if I start explaining it, because I'm bound to go off into a lot of detail if I do. So a great deal of how I'll explain these views will be by quoting his breakdown of the different views, and I'll insert my thoughts alongside of that. Pennington explains the terrible danger of the tendency of Christian theologians to attempt to avoid the moral implications and requirements of the Sermon on the Mount, and he quotes a number of people who see this, as well as those who hold different views. He says, Harvey MacArthur, in his book Understanding the Sermon on the Mount, surveys a great number of interpretations throughout history. One of the things he points out is that almost every one of these interpretations could be called, as he says, versions and evasions of the Sermon on the Mount. The point he's making is that many of the interpretations people make of it are attempts at evading, trying to escape what it's actually saying. He says this is true, I think, especially for Protestants and maybe especially for evangelicals. A lot of times he's talking about the group that he's a part of, can be described as avoiding and evading the clear implications of the Sermon on the Mount. The scholars and ethicists, Glenn Stassen and David Gushee, describe it this way when they argue in their book Kingdom Ethics that the Sermon on the Mount is often neglected and evaded, and they say this evasion of the concrete teachings of Jesus has seriously malformed Christian moral practices, moral beliefs, and moral witness. Jesus taught that the test of our discipleship is whether we act on his teachings, whether we put into practice his words. This is what it means to build our house on the rock. They go on to warn that when Jesus' way of discipleship is thinned down, marginalized, or avoided, then churches and Christians lose their antibodies against infection, talking about spiritual antibodies and spiritual infection, by secular ideologies that manipulate Christians into serving the purposes of some other Lord, and they say we fear that kind of adultery is present now. And it certainly is. We see many people who claim to be Christian, whether they consciously realize their Christianity is just a facade, maybe like a politician who may be just claiming to be Christian because many of his constituents are, and he knows that'll get him more votes, or whether they have invented their own version of Christianity, which many people in our present day have done. They are not depending on the Bible to define their faith. They're not depending on the Bible to define the requirements of their faith or the parameters of their faith. They have essentially invented their own religion and want to call it biblical or call it Christian, both of which are heresy. Pennington goes on to explain that the Anabaptists, unlike Luther, Calvin, and some of the other Reformation period teachers, taught correctly that the Sermon on the Mount was intended to be taken literally and obeyed literally. Pennington notes that part of their conflict with the Lutherans is they felt like Luther and Calvin were actually giving ways of evading the Sermon on the Mount. Luther's response to the Anabaptists was to argue for a two kingdoms view of the Sermon on the Mount. In that interpretation, which I strongly believe is incorrect, by the way, he claimed that there's a private realm and a civic realm, the public realm, and that for the individual Christian, the Sermon on the Mount does apply to them, but it only applies in the private spiritual realm and doesn't apply in the public civic or civil realm. He thus essentially created a split personality spiritual life for Christians where they can make decisions and act in ways that would be completely contradictory to the Sermon on the Mount and its teachings in their public life, in the civic realm, the civil realm, but that they would hold true to those things in their private life when they're in the spiritual realm, like someone that goes to church and does everything they should do in church and maybe does everything they should do in their home, but when they leave their home, it's okay to engage in things that are immoral or unethical as long as you believe it's positive for society in some way, which is kind of silly when you think about it, because how can anything be better for society than the Christian religion? So Luther's essentially saying that the Christian religion isn't the best thing for society, that society should have its own rules, and the Christian religion should only affect our private lives. And though you might think that's not what Luther really believes, you're going to find out if you dig deep enough that is exactly what he believed. He believed that we individually exist as personal Christians in a private sense in terms of having a private faith, but we also exist in a civil and public realm. And in that realm, according to Luther, the Sermon on the Mount doesn't apply in the same way it applies in your private life. He believed you have your secular life and you have your spiritual or personal life. And Pennington says, and I completely agree, that the downstream effect of this kind of belief can be very devastating. First of all, it can create a sort of schizophrenia in one person, so that when they're functioning as an individual and when they're functioning as part of society, there's really two non-organically related moralities that they're following. Pennington says that seems problematic. I'd say that's putting it mildly. It's devastating to the life of a believer to claim that he can live in a split state of spiritual life where he is a Christian behind closed doors or a Christian in his heart or a Christian in the church, but he can act in ways that are totally oppositional to the Christian faith in his public life. The bottom line is that Luther believed that Christians were not required to live out the precepts of the Sermon on the Mount in their public life. They just have to try to live them out as reasonably as they're able, according to him, in their private life. That is plain and simple spiritual compromise. A true Christian has to live out their faith and all of its requirements in every area of their life. God expects to be Lord over all of your life. Not just Lord over your heart, but not your actions, which would be ludicrous because it wouldn't work that way. Or, as some did, certainly as some in the Old Covenant period did, many are doing today, Lord over external actions, but not really your heart. And certainly not your Lord while you're in the church or while you're at home in your private prayers, but not your Lord when you're out in public and dealing with public issues. Some people believe that the development of later Nazi Germany and the many who claim to be Christians who joined or supported the Nazis is a stark example of Luther's belief put into practice. Pennington explains this by saying one of the dark days of the 1930s in Germany is that almost everyone went to church. That is, to the local Lutheran parish, including biblical scholars and others who were part of the Nazi movement, which was very much a movement about German solidarity and values and German nationality. That's where the word Nazi eventually comes from. It's really about German nationalism. He goes on to say, the point, though, for these people who were Lutherans, and even the belief they had that the final solution of the Jews was acceptable, is that they could still be good, faithful Lutherans as individuals in their private lives, and yet societally, civically, in their public lives, and as related to the nation and not the church, they had an obligation to support the German motherland and what was best for it. And apparently, no matter how evil some of the things were they supported, it was okay to support them in their public life because that was what, in their twisted minds, was best for Germany. And they could still be good Christians while doing so, which is absolutely false. Pennington points out that the Lutheran Two Kingdoms view doesn't necessitate the kind of evil that became Nazi Germany, but it certainly allowed that sort of dichotomy to go to seed in a bad way, where one can say, yes, I'm a Christian in an individual, in a private sense, but as a society, we need to do things that are good for society, which may contradict what we might feel as Christians, which how could you possibly think such a thing if you're a genuine Christian? And thus, they approved of the ideas of getting rid of the Jewish people and others and committing terrible and heinous crimes against humanity because in their minds, it's what's best for the nation. And we have to make a distinction between what's best for the nation, no matter how wicked it might be, and what's best for the church, which is more of our private life. What a massively immoral concept. One of the most famous Lutherans of that day, who was a staunch Lutheran and believed in Lutheran doctrines, but who took a strong stance against Luther's Two Kingdoms view, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who ended up losing his life at the hands of the Nazis at the end of World War II. He was taken prisoner and eventually executed, in part because he had been a part of a plot to overthrow Hitler. And though a Lutheran, like most of those who were churchgoers who supported Nazism, he recognized that the Two Kingdoms view is inherently faulty and impossible to reconcile with biblical teaching, and that we have to take a stand against evil. We do have to take a stand against evil, saints. I'm not going to wade into this in any depth because this is a highly controversial point, but we have to be very careful how we address politics, whether positively or negatively, because we need to understand what politics encompasses before we start critiquing different elements of it. Politics in terms of political methods for doing things that are corrupt and perverse should never be exercised by the church. We shouldn't be doing it as believers in the civil realm, trying to accomplish things through corrupted political means. And we certainly should not be doing it inside the church, using corrupt political means to rise the leadership, to hold our positions, to control people, or anything else. On the other hand, if we're arguing that voting for or against something is an act of politics, and thus it would be a sin to vote for or against something, or to take a stand in some public arena for or against something that is a law that might be passed, we are making a serious mistake. Most nations in the history of the world have not had the ability to cast a vote and by doing so potentially slow down or even stop the advance of evil ideas and practices. We do have that ability in our nation. And though I certainly would not encourage somebody to get heavily engaged in politics because it will swallow up your life, it'll swallow up your thinking and everything else. And by the way, when I say that, I'm not talking about becoming a politician or doing evil political methods. I'm talking about getting into promoting certain things and trying to get out the vote and so on, which in and of itself is not evil. All you're trying to do is encourage people to vote a certain way. And forgive me, I know this could offend some, but arguing against voting is not really thinking things through and not really understanding the history of this world. If some terrible and wicked evil is being promoted and certain laws might get passed that would cause that evil to be anchored into the bedrock of our society, and we have the potential, which we still do as citizens of the United States, to cast a vote or to influence our politicians not to pass such a law or to take a stand against that law, why would we not do that? How could you possibly argue that it would be more evil to try to influence someone to vote against evil or to try to influence a politician to take a stand against evil than it would be to allow evil to expand and grow unchecked? There are periods in the history of our nation where 75 to 80% or more of the people of this nation identified as, and that's the problem, a lot of people identify as something they're not, but they identified as Christians. If they were actually Christians, in the biblical definition of that word, which is the only one that counts, when certain things rose up in our society, some of which rose up 50 years ago and some of which have risen up in the last decade or two, if they actually were the Christians they claimed to be, and they actually had exercised influence over the politicians that they have the power to vote in or out of office, and told them if you vote for this or if you stand for this, you will never get elected, none of us that claim to be Christians will ever vote for you, because it goes against the grain of our moral values as Christians, perhaps some things would have never gotten passed into law, or at the very least, they would have been slowed down. And there are some terribly, diabolically wicked things that have been legalized in our nation that have cost the lives of millions of innocents, that if in the day that those laws were passed, all of those who actually claimed to be Christian had been standing on Christian values and had told their politicians, you had better not support this and you had better take a stand against it, it would not have been passed and we could have potentially saved millions of innocent lives. Yes, I do believe that evil is increasing and that God is allowing it to increase. But we cannot become fatalist in the sense that we think that, well, the United States or whatever other nation or nations are all going to be judged, so we just have to get out of the way and let God do it. We couldn't slow him down or stop him. I can just give you one example among many, and that is Jeremiah. God specifically told Jeremiah that the people of Judah were not going to listen to him. They were not going to heed God's words, and God was going to judge them. But he still required Jeremiah to very publicly and very openly preach against their sin and to take a stand against it in every way. It made Jeremiah's life miserable because he knew the people aren't going to respond to my messages, but I still have to preach them. He still had a responsibility, though, to preach those messages and take a stand against that evil. In the most gentle way I can put it, I find it very troubling when we present the idea of voting for the purpose of stopping some evil or promoting some good, and I mean morally good or morally evil things, as somehow being an evil itself. As if voting against some terrible law that will allow for evil to be practiced in our nation is worse than just standing back and allowing that evil to continue to grow. Yes, evil is going to continue to grow. And yes, God does have a purpose in allowing it. And yes, we are not going to stop it in the long run. But I cannot imagine feeling anything but terror standing before the Almighty at some point if you had an opportunity to stand against evil or slow the spread of evil, and you refuse to do so because you claim trying to take any action that would slow its spread would be more evil than letting it spread. That goes right back to this quote that is often made that is absolutely true. And I'll word it in a little bit more modernized form. The one thing that guarantees the success of evil is when good men do nothing. And sometimes the very good men that have done nothing are good men in the church who claim that doing nothing is somehow holier than doing something, when the doing something they should have done is taking a stand against evil And they chose not to take a stand against evil because taking a stand against evil, in their minds, was more evil than the evil itself. There are many layers of that, and I do not want you to think that means that I am behind a whole lot of political action and political involvement. I think you can get yourself completely swallowed up and drowned in that sea of political activism, no matter how good your motives might be. That is not our purpose. But we still live in a nation where wickedness can be slowed through the activity of something as simple as driving down the road and pushing some buttons to vote against something that is wicked. And I do not discourage individuals from doing that, because doing so is, no matter how you want to look at it, taking a stand against evil. And the church is always intended to take a stand against evil, especially when that evil will affect the society around them, which, by the way, is made up of the very people we're trying to save. So the more that we can restrain evil in the society around us, the more potential we have to reach people before they're completely overwhelmed by that evil and addicted to it, which many people in this present day are becoming exactly that, addicted to carnal ideas and to evil practices and other things. I want to strongly note, though, that I am not criticizing anybody saying that we should not be political or become overly involved in politics. I agree, we should not, because that will become who you are. You'll be more of a political activist than you will be a Christian eventually. That is not my point. But my point is that we can't go to the other extreme and say that we just need to disengage from all activity in society and essentially do what Luther's Two Kingdoms view teaches. And say, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to live my Christian life in my private home. I'm only going to talk about the faith or maybe even preach or teach inside the walls of the church, which is not biblical by any stretch of the imagination. You just take a walk through the Bible and find out how many of the messages, including very direct and sometimes very controversial subjects and statements, were made by men of God in the Old and in the New Testament behind closed doors where nobody can hear it. You're hiding away from the world and trying to make sure there's nothing presented in public venues. You're going to find that the vast majority, I do mean vast, of messages in the Bible were given in a very public way. And many times you'll find out in the New Testament, you go through the book of Acts, that many of those messages that were given that were some of the most controversial, that though there were times, certainly when they were preaching and teaching within someone's home or some more enclosed area, the majority of the time, and by the way, when the most controversial subjects were being addressed, it appears they were doing so in very public places and sometimes in places that were highly resistant to the message. So we have no biblical excuse for those kind of arguments. We have no biblical excuse for disengaging and getting off on a mountain somewhere like the monastic orders did in the early period of the Roman Church and hiding out away from the world and privatizing our faith. God in heaven forbid. That is not the Christian faith that you're describing if that's what you think we're supposed to be doing. Continuing on with some of Luther's beliefs, there's another element of his belief about the Sermon on the Mount that's held in one form or another by many Reformed Protestants, and that's that the Sermon on the Mount is an expression of the law and not of grace. Pennington states that for Luther, in his strong dichotomous way of splitting everything into law and gospel, or law and grace, the primary function of the Sermon on the Mount texts apply to us, but they apply to us in the sense of showing us that we're failures, showing us that we're broken, condemning us so that we can repent and turn to God in Christ and find His grace. What Pennington's saying about Luther's belief, and this is what Luther believed, and it's what many Christians believe, unfortunately, is that Christ's statements in the Sermon on the Mount aren't actually intended to instigate any of us to strive to keep those commands, or to even think it would be possible to try to keep those commands. But supposedly, the commands in the Sermon on the Mount are just intended to make us think about how impossible they are, so that we will then, again supposedly, realize that we're incapable of doing anything that's good, and will turn to God to help us. Though on one level that's true, there are two problems with that. Number one, this argument that is often made by Reformed preachers that there is nothing that man could ever do that is good is based on a handful of scriptures that isn't talking about every person in all of history in a negative way, like saying their righteousnesses are all filthy rags, as if every human being that ever existed who did anything righteous, it was just filthy rags. That was talking to a specific group of people who were not doing acts of true righteousness. He wasn't talking to all mankind. And you're going to find that of the handful of scriptures that seem to convey that all mankind is so wicked that no one can ever do anything good, it's not talking about all mankind. It's talking about all mankind outside of a relationship with God, or those who are just living out a facade of their faith. Because you're going to find many times in the Bible that God actually praises individuals who are part of his people for doing things that are righteous, that are clearly actions they themselves took. So making that argument is insensible when on one hand God says that all the righteousnesses of some people are nothing but filthy rags, while simultaneously talking about some other people who are doing righteous actions. And he makes it very clear in a number of passages that he didn't make them do those righteous actions, or he didn't override their brain and program them to do those righteous actions. They did them by choice, and he's praising them for some of the things they did by their own choice that were righteous. So the idea that we are all incapable of doing anything good is simply false. We're incapable of doing enough good to save ourselves. We could never do enough good to save ourselves in and of ourselves. And we're incapable of living at the level God wants us to in terms of the perfect good that he's seeking, in terms of the complete perfection he's seeking. But we're only incapable of those things without God. With God, all things are possible. So with God, we are capable of those things. If we're truly the people of God, and if God gives us the instructions and the empowerment, we can keep the mandates and dictates of the gospel of the kingdom, part of which is conveyed in the Sermon on the Mount. So as I said, on one level, what Luther's saying is true. Those who aren't in a relationship with God do have to recognize there's nothing they can do to be saved outside of a relationship with him. That's certainly true. But the unsaved are not, by any stretch of the imagination, the primary audience of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' disciples and his followers are the primary audience. The commands that God gives to his people should cause them to recognize their limited state and should compel them to turn to him for help, for his mercy, for his grace, for his directions, and for his strength. But that doesn't mean that God's people aren't intended to obey his commands because they just look to be so impossible, and when we see them, they're just so big that it makes us think how little we are. Yes, we are that little. But his commands are still his commands. And our recognition of our limitations and our lack in certain areas is not intended to make us stop striving. It's intended to create in us a greater hunger and thirst for righteousness. One of the very first things Jesus is going to say when he begins the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." He doesn't, by the way, say in these statements, "Blessed are those that God makes hunger and thirst for righteousness," or those that hunger and thirst for righteousness because God programmed them to do that. No. It's our hunger and our thirst that comes from within us. Yes, God instigates it. He has to light that fire, but we have to keep it alive. If we keep alive the fire within for righteousness, and we realize we're not living up to the standards of what God is asking, and those are very clearly conveyed in the Sermon on the Mount, of course it will cause us to go seek God. But that doesn't mean we go seek God to take care of it for us without us having any personal responsibility. It means that we go seek God to help us to do what he's telling us to do. Yes, he has to help us do it, but we do have to do it. And yes, he will do that which only he can do, but we do still have to do what he's telling us to do. So the motive of Jesus' message, as I started saying, isn't intended to encourage us to cease striving to live up to his mandates. We have to strive to be genuine believers and true citizens of the kingdom, as he is defining those things in the Sermon on the Mount. But of course, we're only going to be able to do that in the light and in the strength that he and his Father give us. Going back to Pennington, with whom I do agree in most of the way he responds to this particular type of interpretation, he says, my problem with Luther's view is that ultimately it still ends up being an evasion of the Sermon on the Mount. And it certainly is. In that you could look at those high demands and say, yes, I'm a sinner, I need God's grace, and then that's as far as it goes. You don't wrestle through what does that mean then for me to really seek to live that kind of righteousness, and how do I have a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, as Jesus is going to say in Matthew 5:20. So Pennington says, even though what Luther is saying is true in some sense, that the Sermon on the Mount does cast upon us our lostness so that we can cast ourselves upon grace, while that is true on some level, Pennington says, and I completely agree, I think ultimately that's going to short-circuit a good reading of the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, when you're just saying, all that the Sermon on the Mount is intended to do is make me feel little and to realize how I can't do anything and I need God, you certainly do need to feel that way, but you're going to short-circuit the next step of its purpose, and that is that once you realize that you're not capable and you do seek God and God provides you with his insight and his empowerment, you then are expected to strive to keep the things that are being mandated in the Sermon on the Mount. And if you stop at the first part of that, where you recognize how little you are and how much you need God, and how impossible it is without God, then you will short circuit your full salvation, because part of your salvation involves you responding to what God is telling you and you obeying what God's requiring of you. One of the most diabolically false views of the message and the meaning and the mandates that are given in the Sermon on the Mount is what is sometimes referred to as the classic dispensational view. By the way, that's not talking about dispensationalism in the sense of prophecy or people that believe in different dispensations. It's a little more specialized meaning than that. Pennington explains that the classical dispensational view would say that the Sermon on the Mount actually doesn't apply to Christians at all. In a traditional classical dispensational view, the whole book of Matthew, and in some ways everything that is pre-Pentecost, gets slotted into the Old Covenant, and the Sermon on the Mount would clearly be an example of that, according to that view. One of the leading and important classical dispensational writers, Lewis Sperry Chafer, says, as a rule of life, the Sermon on the Mount is addressed to the Jew before the cross and to the Jew in the coming kingdom, and is therefore not now for the church, for New Covenant believers, according to him, in effect. The point of this seriously faulty view is that the Sermon on the Mount, and really the vast majority, if not all of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, applies before the church existed, and thus, according to people who hold that view, doesn't really apply to the church. It's just talking to the Jews, and I've even heard it said that since the Jews didn't accept it, that the laws and mandates and purpose of the Sermon on the Mount was completely circumvented. And that if they had accepted Jesus as their Messiah as a nation, then all of those laws would have gone into effect. But just for them, not for the church. As if there is some distinction between the Jews and the church when it comes to the moral laws of God. You realize the laws that are communicated in the Sermon on the Mount don't address very many ritual laws. The majority of them are moral and deeper heart level issues. And how could you possibly argue those would only apply to natural genetic Jews in their kingdom, but wouldn't apply to the rest of the church and the rest of the world that's going to inhabit the new heavens and the new earth? It's a foolish and dangerous interpretation. But that type of interpretation is necessary, though it's still wrong, for someone to come up with who simply cannot accept that the very high standard and high requirements we see communicating the Sermon on the Mount really is intended for them. Just like some of the other interpretations I've quoted or I have given you quotes from Pennington on, this type of interpretation is nothing but pure evasion. It's an attempt to avoid responsibility for keeping the requirements that are recorded in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's a blatant example of presuppositional doctrinal bias as well, because those who hold this view simply can't accept that believers can be lost if they don't firmly hold to their faith and obey God's commands after their conversion and deliverance from their past sins. Now, how do I know that? Because in another place, Chafer argues that one of the reasons the Sermon on the Mount cannot be talking to the church is because Jesus warns in Matthew 5:22 and 5:29-30 about the danger of hellfire for those who are part of the kingdom. So someone holding this faulty view would say that they believe that a Christian, once they're converted, cannot ever fall away or lose their salvation or have to face eternal judgment. So thus the warnings for people in the kingdom facing fiery or eternal judgment can't be talking to Christians. That just shows you how warped your mind can become by your doctrinal presumptions. One of those being that somebody who has been converted can never lose their relationship with the Lord, no matter what they do from that point on. So they would never have to face hellfire or eternal judgment or some of the other terms that are used for the process and the eventual end result of eternal judgment. That is simply false. There's many other places in the Bible that talk about the potential for the people of God falling away or losing their relationship with the Lord. There's many other places in the New Testament, after the four Gospels, by the way, that talk about the people of God, not just the Jews, but the people of God in general, who are the church, potentially losing their relationship with the Lord or falling away from that relationship and having then to face destructive judgment. And it requires entirely ignoring very direct statements of the Scripture about Christians losing their salvation and being reprobate. Paul himself was concerned that if he did not do what was necessary, he himself, and he was certainly a believer and a Spirit-filled believer on top of that, he himself could be a castaway. The Greek word of which is the same word for a reprobate. You're not going to be saved if you're a reprobate, which means Paul knew that the potential could be that he could become reprobate and thus not be saved. And we can't avoid those statements, no matter how blinded we become by our presuppositional biases about the nature of salvation. And sadly, very often when I hear people from a Reformed background try to argue for their beliefs, they either quote scriptures that are not applicable to what they're trying to make them applicable to, and usually only a handful of those, Or they quote big rhetorical declarations that are found nowhere in the Bible, or about how all you need is faith and you will be saved no matter what you do, and using statements like faith alone that are also not found in quite that type of expression in the Bible. And if you're going to look for the statement faith alone, you're actually going to find it in James, where he says that faith alone without works, without the acts of obedience that it should instigate, is dead. And thus, faith alone is certainly not what we ought to be shouting from the rooftops, because faith alone is dead. And that is precisely what the Bible says. Faith can never be alone. If faith is alive and genuine and true, it will always include in its entourage responses to it and obedience to its requirements that are what some people, unfortunately, label as meaningless works when they're not meaningless works. There are certainly meaningless works. You can do a lot of things that aren't going to do a thing towards your salvation. But there are other things that God requires of us that we have to do if we're going to be saved. And he is very clear about those requirements. So I started saying this is nothing but a blatant example of presuppositional doctrinal bias, because those who don't believe that believers can lose their salvation or lose their relationship with the Lord don't know what to do with the statement when it says that if you're in the kingdom, you'll be cast out of the kingdom. Or if you're in the kingdom and you're not loyal to the king and obedient to his commands, you could face the judgment of eternal fire. They don't understand that, so they have to try to argue that's talking about someone other than themselves. What a sad and dangerous approach. If you don't believe that Christians can fall away and by doing so put themselves in jeopardy of tribulation and hellfire and eventually eternal judgment, then of course you are going to wrongly have to go looking for some other meaning for the warnings that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere regarding those exact things. So it is so important that we understand the actual purpose of the Sermon on the Mount and what people it's talking to and what its precepts are requiring of us, or we will fail to meet the standard that Jesus himself set for his church. The Sermon on the Mount is a trumpet call to true spiritual change, part of which is undeniably accomplished through the choices of the one who has to change and the actions and thoughts and other things that have to be transformed in that individual. God does what only God can do, and we're expected to do what God's commanded and empowered us to do. It's exactly what that statement in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, the 12th, 13th verse, that we quote so often is talking about. When it says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you to will and to do of his good pleasure." And I hear people who don't want to accept the first part of that, who just quote the last part. And they get excited and say, how dare you say anyone has to do anything as part of their salvation? It's God that's working in you. Would you please read the sentence right before that? It says, work out your own salvation, meaning there's a tandem operation going on. God is working on the things only God can do. And then he's given you the power to work on the things that he expects you to do. You're not doing them in the flesh. So people say, how dare you think that a human being could live up to that standard? I don't think a human being without God's help could live up to that standard. We're not doing it in the flesh. We aren't going to be able to do it in the flesh. It's not by an act of the will. It's by an act of the will combined with the grace of God. There were people under the old covenant that probably would have longed. I've used examples before like Daniel and some of these mighty men of God in the Old Testament who I think would have longed to be able to rise to the level of what new covenant perfection is. They lived at the highest level I think they could live. And I've said it before. I feel like they were pressing against the ceiling. Oh, I wish I could get closer to God. I wish I could get closer to God. Now under the new covenant, the Holy Spirit is available in a way it was not available under the old covenant. And you can get closer to God. That's why I say when Daniel comes up in the resurrection, which I believe is in the future, not already in the past, as some believe, I think he will soar right on into perfection because I think it was the desire of his heart all his life. And he was pressing with all of his strength at the boundaries of his relationship with God, trying to get closer to God. You couldn't get any closer to God under the law. The law made nothing perfect. It took the bringing in of a better hope to accomplish that. And now we have a better hope than they had under the law. It said under the law, the conscience could not be made perfect. Do you realize what that's telling you? It would have to be meaning that under the new covenant, the conscience can be made perfect. And if your conscience can be made perfect, how do you get any more perfect than that? If you can be made perfect down at the heart and soul and conscience level, now, I'm talking from Hebrews 7 and Hebrews 9, and we'll come to those verses maybe another time and get in more detail. I'm going through this fast because I don't want to spend 3 nights talking on the introductory elements to this Sermon on the Mount. I want to get into the Sermon on the Mount. But if we don't do our part of what God expects us to do, which is exactly what the Sermon on the Mount is talking about in many of its statements. God is not going to just make it up by doing it for us because we just don't feel like it or we don't think it's possible or we're not willing to try to do it. If he's instructed and empowered us to do something and he's commanded us to do it, then he expects us to do it. It is not empty and vain words Jesus was preaching in the Sermon on the Mount that don't apply to the people he was preaching them to. So God works in us to the degree that we continue working out our own salvation. God will keep working in you as long as you are trying to work out your salvation. God gives you the power, and you work with the power you've got. If you stop working with it and you say, I don't feel like doing this, I know the power's there. I know if I go to church, I'll hear messages about how to get it done or the necessity of it, but I don't feel like doing that. I want to take a break. I'm not going to do it. You can't expect God to just take up the slack. When you're capable, he's given you the ability to go on to perfection, and then you don't want to do the work of going on to perfection, so I don't have to worry. God will take up the slack. God's not going to take up the slack in the areas where he's provided the insight and empowerment for you to do that job. The key thing is, before we even try to get into the Sermon on the Mount, why I'm spending so much time on this, we cannot reimagine the Sermon on the Mount as a message that's not even actually intended for us or for the audience that he was giving it to in his day. And he's calling us today to hear it, I believe, too, which is why I think the Sermon on the Mount is so significant. It is a high calling without doubt. It's a calling of a high level of personal holiness and righteousness that goes far deeper and is more comprehensive than was ever possible under the Old Covenant. And apparently it's far more complete than many theologians want to accept or are willing to attempt to strive for. Jesus does not word this message as something that's not applicable or not possible for those he's preaching it to. He's wording it in a way that is saying we are coming to a level now that Jesus is establishing the kingdom, that the power is going to be present for you to live up to a level you haven't lived up to before, not for you to continue to live at the level you always have. God forbid we would undermine the potency of this powerful message by claiming it's not possible for us to actually live up to or obey it, or by claiming that the internal changes that it's asking of us, as we're going to see, are beyond our capacity and it'll just happen to us without our involvement at some far distant future point. There'd be no need for him to give the commands if he's just going to make it happen to us. There'd be no need for him to ask us to do certain things or require certain things of us. If he's not really requiring them, he's going to do them in us without us needing to do anything to respond to what he's doing or to work in tandem with him. That's simply not what is being communicated in the Sermon on the Mount. So, the Sermon on the Mount is a call to a new degree of relationship, a new depth of spiritual maturity that's possible now under the new covenant. And Jesus is in the process in that sermon of establishing the mandates and things that are going to be necessary to remain a part of that kingdom. Jesus appears to radically redefine the depth of change that God expects of his people and the line of distinction as well between those who are truly God's and those who are just wearing a facade of faith. They're just clothed in a surface level robe of righteousness that is so sheer in its composition and so thin in its outward expression that you can see the flesh beneath just as clear as day. That is not what Jesus is looking for. I believe what he's doing is accomplishing what God always intended for mankind. I think God always intended mankind to come to a level of full spiritual development, full perfection. It wasn't possible under the Old Covenant, but it is possible under the New Covenant when God is involved in the process, when God provides the power and the understanding and the wisdom and the knowledge and the other components that are necessary to bring us to that level. That is why the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus' other teachings for that matter, focus so heavily on genuine internal change that then affects external elements. The message of the Sermon on the Mount is a message of authentic faith in and relationship with God that calls the citizen of the kingdom not only to obey God's commands externally, but to be completely changed at the heart level, at the soul level, to have the conscience perfected, as I said earlier, for that statement in Hebrews 9:9, and character within. And that will be accomplished through the changing of the conscience. When your conscience is changed, your character will be changed. And when your character is changed, your choices will be changed. Your choices about what you think about, your choices about the way you feel about things, your choices in terms of the actions you take and the words that you say. And that, saints, is why it is so crucial that we don't undermine that grand and glorious purpose of the Sermon on the Mount by attempting to argue, as many in Christendom do, that the instructions in the Sermon on the Mount are just not possible for anyone to ever live up to. Anyone that would teach that is simply a false teacher. God forbid we would effectively ignore the call to change that's so powerfully put forth in the Sermon on the Mount. It's one of the most poignant sermons that were ever preached. God forbid that we ignore that call by claiming, as some people do, that it's not actually possible to change to the degree that Jesus is commanding and describing there. God forbid that we would reimagine its commands as nothing more than empty rhetoric that just ascribes a standard of spiritual expectation that God already knows nobody can reach. And so it would be almost pointless to be preaching this message. God forbid that we would excuse ourselves by arguing that we've not seen anyone live up to that level of spiritual maturity, and then argue that that's the evidence why it can't be done, as if being surrounded by evil men means that we can't rise any higher than the evil men around us. What a horrible idea. You say, when I look around me, I see wickedness on all sides, so I guess all I can be is wicked, right? You realize that's the same argument? I look around me, I don't see anybody that is living like Jesus, so I guess nobody can live like Jesus. You just flip that coin. I look around me and I see debauchery and wickedness on all sides, so I guess I have no choice but to be debauched and wicked, right? What a foolish argument. God forbid that despite the calls that we're going to hear in the Sermon on the Mount to deeper depths of spiritual development that are obviously expectations of the citizens of the kingdom, we would try to explain away any actual responsibility on our part by looking for any excuse why that can't be talking to us. God forbid we would expect the righteousness that's revealed in the Sermon on the Mount to be imputed to us in some point instead of actually required of us as it's ascribed. That kind of reinvention of the revelation of the new covenant relationship that's found in the Sermon on the Mount is nothing more than a work of iniquity. And I believe it's doctrines of devils that produce that kind of teaching, that have deceived some people into a static and stagnant spiritual life. Why would you want to have a static and stagnant spiritual life that's not moving and growing? You're developing and getting closer to God. But instead, you think you can just go on living in sin, awaiting God to make them righteous and holy, and assuming God, no matter how wicked they are, sees them as righteous and holy because they've got a completely skewed understanding of the work of the cross and the blood of Jesus, and think that there's this drapery of blood covering you, that everywhere you go, no matter how wicked you are for the rest of your life, all God will see is the blood. Is that right? Most everyone sees the Passover as a picture of what Jesus did. And the blood on the lintel of the doorpost, a picture of his blood. If you took off out of the house, would you still be safe? It's only in the house where the blood has been applied that you're safe. If you decide there's things I want to do out there, the Egyptians are holding a party and I got invited, I wouldn't advise you to show up on that night. One other issue that we'll touch on real quick before we close out is another element that some people think the Sermon on the Mount is addressing that is inaccurate, that can lead you to some wrong interpretations. Some people believe that the Old Covenant continues on. The Mosaic Law, its rituals, its ceremonies, all that continues on. And that the New Covenant is just a more empowered version of the Old Covenant and its laws. And we're going to be addressing this when we go through the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus touches on some of these issues. You've got to see how Jesus deals with the Old Covenant law. Ben Witherington explained the different ways that Jesus addressed the law in the Sermon on the Mount. It says sometimes he intensifies its demands, particularly if they're moral issues. Sometimes he sets its demands aside. Sometimes he affirms its demands. Sometimes he offers a new teaching that can either supplement or in some cases supplant some of the law's demands. Sometimes he fulfills its promise or demands. It's really not possible, he says, to claim that Jesus in the antithesis is simply contrasting his teaching with the oral traditions of the elders, which is what some Torah-observant people like to claim. They say Jesus wasn't criticizing anything in the law of Moses. He was just criticizing the traditions they added. Well, the traditions they added were certainly things he criticized, but he also dealt with some things in the law of Moses that were going to be changed. And that is the key point I want you to get. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion about it here, but part of the Sermon on the Mount, the last thing I'm going to address tonight, is changing of some things. He makes some clear statements that the law is not going to pass away, and yet he goes into statements about the law and makes adaptations and changes to them. That's because the law is not passing away. It's being transformed. Some parts of it are being fulfilled. There's no point in continuing in blood sacrifice if he fulfilled the sacrifice, right? So someone might say, well, that part would have to go away then. No, it's not going away. It's being changed into something new and better. The sacrifice is still there. It's just one sacrifice for sin forever now instead of thousands upon thousands of animal sacrifices. The law didn't change in the sense that it went away and disappeared. It was fulfilled and became something better. And that's at the heart of this as well as we go through some of these statements in the Sermon on the Mount that's addressing the law. It's a lot of information for a session like this, but I'm just trying to give you a lot of the underlying issues and background points and thematic issues related to the Sermon on the Mount before we actually get into it. So there's two major points that I want you to have in your mind as we get ready to go into the Sermon on the Mount. First of all, the Sermon on the Mount is a mission statement and a manifesto of the New Covenant kingdom. And it's a series of mandates regarding the requirements of being a true, genuine, fully spiritually developed citizen of that kingdom. And then second, the Sermon on the Mount is not a call to a continuation of the Old Covenant and its Mosaic laws or some just merely external level of righteousness. It is a call to come under a higher and more ancient law that was God's original intent for mankind, and that's the fulfillment of the types and shadows of the ceremonial and ritual law, and that's intended to be fully fulfilled in the work of Christ and the operation and activities that will take us on to perfection. And that is the heart of the message of the Sermon on the Mount. It is the message of going on to perfection. It is the message of internal transformation. It is a message of personal responsibility and the highest levels of holiness and righteousness, not just attributed or imputed to an individual, even though they aren't righteous, but a requirement for you to war within, to be changed, to be more like Jesus, to bear your cross, to follow in his footsteps, to run your race, to fight the good fight until you lay hold on eternal life. Praise his holy name.